Sáhkku is a board game invented by the Sami people. The game is particularly traditional among the Coast Sámi of northern Norway and Russia, but is also known to have been played in other parts of Sápmi. Rules: Sáhkku is a running fight game, which means that players move their pieces along a track with the goal of eliminating the other player's pieces. Many different versions of Sáhkku have been played in different parts of Sápmi. The following describes the rules that appear, according to written sources, to have been most widely practiced across different localities. The oral transfer of the Sáhkku rules between generations was largely broken off during the 1900s, so that modern rule sets have to rely on accounts written by outsiders. While valuable, these accounts are often ambiguous or lacking when it comes to important parts of the gameplay. As regards the points where it is uncertain which rules were generally applied at the time Sáhkku was most widely played, this will be noted in the text. Board: A sakku board traditionally consists of 3 horizontal lines intersected by a larger number of vertical lines. The pieces occupy the intersections of these horizontal and vertical lines. Some boards feature only the central horizontal line, or even none at all. However, the pieces still occupy the same notional intersections. The central point of the middle row, sometimes referred to as the castle, is indicated by a sakku symbol, sun symbol, or other ornament. Pieces: The standard game features 15 gelgut, 15 old mate and 1 gonagas. The men and women are collectively referred to as soldiers, while 15 is the normal number of soldiers on both sides. The number has varied according to the length of the board. The smallest number of soldiers described as being used is 8, and the highest is 20. The latter is described as being used in the Finnmark fisheries, without any further geographic specification. In the sakku set donated by Isaac Saba, the women's pieces had hooked-shaped tops, symbolizing the traditional North Sami jockapere hat, which disappeared at the end of the 1800s because Christian missionaries and evangelists attacked the design for being a symbol of the devil's horn. The men's pieces were topped by cones. Elsewhere in Sápmi, the pieces appear to have had a simpler shape, both pieces ending in a sharpened pyramid, which for the women had a notch cut into it at the top. As for the shape of the king, this varies a lot between game sets. At its simplest, the king piece is a tall, slender pyramid with 4 sides. More often, ornaments are cut into the sides. Many of the king pieces are so elaborately carved that the pyramidal shape is only suggested. Set up at the beginning of the game, rows of men and women face each other on opposite rows of points. The castle is occupied by the king. Dice are thrown to determine who begins the game. The player who first throws a sakku may start. Dice: The dice used for sakku are 4-face-long dice or stick dice. They are shaped like slightly elongated cubes whose short ends are sharpened to points so that they can only land on 4 of their sides. One side of each die bears the mark X, the sakku symbol. The numbers on the other sides of the die have been known to vary. A common combination is XEII0, although other combinations have been known to exist. Typically 3 dice are used. The dice are traditionally thrown in a bowl, rather than on the table. Movement: When having thrown the dice, the player can choose if the sum of all 3 dice values shall be used to move only one of the player's pieces, or the value of 1 die shall be used to move 1 piece, while the sum of the other 2 dice are used to move another piece, or the 3 dice values shall be used to move 3 separate pieces. Each time a piece lands on a point after having moved according to the value of 1 die, it must perform the required action on that point, even if it is to immediately use the value of another die to move further. Several pieces are allowed to occupy the same point. The soldiers: When the game begins, the soldiers are inactive, that is, unable to move. A player can activate a soldier by throwing a sakku. When activated, a soldier is moved 1 point ahead. After activation, dice are used to determine how many points soldiers can move ahead during their turn. The soldiers move in a set pattern: towards the player's right when they are in their home row, towards the left when they are in the middle row, and towards the right when they are in the enemy row. They move in a theoretically endless, 8-shaped pattern. Force pattern or free pattern activation. Force pattern activation here means that soldiers have to be activated in turn, starting with the players foremost, and continuing towards the back. The registered rule sets are unclear regarding whether activation is forced or free. The rules regarding the Sáhkku king has been described differently by different authors, who have based their reports on gameplay in different parts of Sápmi. In all variants, the king begins neutral, not controlled by either player. Recruiting the king in several registered variants, the first player to throw a sakku not only begins the game, but also immediately recruits the king, and is henceforth able to move it as they please. In other variants, the king is recruited by the first player to move one of their pieces onto the point currently occupied by the king. Moving the king. Several different rules for how one may move the king have been documented. In the racer variant, the king moves like the soldiers of the player who currently controls it. In the earliest written rules for sakku, written down by the researcher J. A. Fries in 1871, the description of the king's movement is unclear. The text just states that the king may be moved both forwards and backwards or to the right and left. The board drawn to illustrate this is turned so that right and left is identical to forwards and backwards. Also, in the example of play, which showcases available alternative first moves after a throw of XX3 by the player that has the king, the only given alternative that involves moving the king at all is to move it 5 and 3 fields forwards into the enemy row, by which it captures the enemy soldiers on field 40 and 43. This description has been interpreted in many conflicting ways. The king can move orthogonally right, left, up, and down. This means that when reaching an end of the middle row, it can choose to go up into the enemy row, or down into the home row, and also that it can move between the horizontal lines. These rules were noted to be used in the jougasakku variant, where it was specified that it cannot change direction while utilizing the value of one die. The fate of the king. In most variants of sakku, the loyalty of the king can change during the course of the game. The player not currently playing with the king may recruit it by moving a soldier onto the point currently occupied by the king. The king then becomes part of that player's army, until it is recruited by the opposing player again. In these variants of the game, the king cannot itself be captured, only recruited. In the Osaka variant, a player who moves one of their soldiers onto a field occupied by the king may capture it and remove it from the board, like the ordinary soldiers. The earliest description of sakku gameplay is ambiguous as regards this. There is no mention that the king can be captured by the opposing player, but also no mention that the opposing player can recruit it. Capturing soldiers. The object of the game is to capture all of the opponent's soldiers, that is, to remove them from the board. An opponent's soldier is captured when a player moves a soldier, or the recruited king, onto a point occupied by the opponent. If the point in question is occupied by several opposing soldiers, all those soldiers are captured. A captured soldier is removed from the board, and not entered again. In Sami, the act of capturing a soldier is referred to as got it, to kill. Inactive soldiers, vulnerable or not. In some areas, the rules prohibited the capture of inactive soldiers, while in other areas the capture of inactive soldiers has been allowed. It is unknown what was the most widespread, or original, rule. In the first written account of sakku gameplay, inactive soldiers are vulnerable. The literature indicates, but does not state clearly, that inactive soldiers could be captured in the racer variant. Only the jougasakku variant is described explicitly as having a rule against capturing inactive soldiers. Variants. There are many versions of sakku, with rules that differ slightly or substantially from each other. In the following we will first present some general rule variations. and then present three distinct versions of the game from different parts of the area where it was traditionally played. General rule variations. Opening alternatives. An alternate way of opening the game is that the players begin by seeing who first manages to get 3 sakku in 3 consecutive throws. When doing this, the dice that have landed on sakku are set aside before the next throw. The player who first gets 3 sakku in this manner plays first, instead of going directly into normal gameplay. The game can be opened with a starting round in which the player can choose if they want to activate the foremost soldier and move it 3 points ahead, or activate the 3 foremost soldiers and move each 1 point ahead, or activate 2 of the 3 foremost soldiers and move these 2 and 1 points ahead respectively. Jumping activation. When using X to activate a soldier, that soldier is generally moved 1 field ahead. In the earliest recorded variant of sakku, however, the player moves soldiers 4 extra fields ahead upon activation. This is essentially using the full value of the X when activating. In this version it is also possible to use X when activating, in the following manner. If a player gets more than 1 X and uses all of them to activate pieces, the player can distribute the total value of the X's freely between the pieces they just activated. For example, instead of moving the 2 pieces 1 plus 4 and 1 plus 4 fields ahead, one piece can be moved 1 while the other is moved 1 plus 8 ahead. King's Children. Some versions of the game have included King's Children, 2 pieces placed 4 squares away from the king on either side. Their design indicates that each player had 1 such piece. Boards with markings for King's Children are known from Varjavana, Osaka, Arna and Pekum, i.e., the easternmost part of the region where sakku was traditionally played. The rules for using these pieces are lost. It has been speculated that the King's Children were imported from another Sami board game, Dablo. The rules for Dablo King's Children are known. Both sides have a King's Child which is allowed to capture soldiers and each other, but are not allowed to capture kings, and cannot be captured by the soldiers. Just like sakku was apparently played without King's Children in the westernmost part of the region where sakku was traditionally played. North Troms, the version of Dablo played in that district, also lacked King's Children. Playing from the same side of the board. A version of sakku has existed where the player's soldiers begin on same side of the board, although the target of the game was jougasakku the same. The rules for this variant have been lost. Jougasakku. The following variant has been described as played in the village of Jougasakku in Davasirdi municipality, Finnmark. The variant rules presented here were written down around the turn of the millennium. The king moves as described in the rules under. Capturing inactive soldiers cannot be captured. Locking soldiers. It is possible to lock some of the opposing player's soldiers. This happens when a player places one of his soldiers, or the recruited king, on the point immediately in front of an inactive piece of the opposing players. This inactive soldier, and other inactive soldiers standing in row behind it, is now locked. It is not possible to activate them until the locking piece is removed. Locked soldiers cannot be captured, but if a player loses all their active soldiers, and all their inactive soldiers are locked, the player has lost the game. The text does not mention what happens if the row of soldiers is broken before a lock occurs. If one soldier in the middle of the row which now has a locking piece in front of it has been previously activated, the rules are silent regarding whether or not the soldiers behind the hole in the row are also locked, or if they are still free to activate and move. Jougasakku. The following variant is attested from the Osaka region of Finnish Lapland. Board and setup. It is possible, but not certain, that in the starting position, the first square was left open. Dice have the numbers XEIII4. When a player throws X, they get to throw the die that showed X again, after they have used the sakku as they please. The sakku-giving dice continue to be thrown again until it lands on another value than X. The soldier's movement. The path of the soldiers is identical to that of the pieces in Dal Das. towards the player's left in their home row, towards the right in the middle row, towards the left in the enemy row, and do not return to the home row, but instead keep walking in a circle in the middle and enemy row. The king can be captured and removed from the board, like the ordinary soldiers. Racer Sáhkku. The version of sakku is traditional to Racer municipality and the wider North Troms district around it. The rules were written down in the 1950s. Design. The board tends to be designed with squares, as in chess, instead of with points formed by intersecting horizontal and vertical lines. The king is often topped with a bishop's crook. Board and setup. There tends to be 3 times 13 squares, with 12 soldiers on each of the side's home rows. In the starting position, the rightmost square is left open. Dice. The racer version calls for 2 dice, instead of the normal 3. The dice show X, i.e. 3. X signifies 1, and never 5. When a player throws X, they get to throw the die that showed X again, after they have used the sakku as they please. The sakku-giving dice continue to be thrown again until it lands on another value than X. The soldier's movement. It is not possible to move one individual piece by using the combined values of 2 or more dice. The movements of one piece must correspond to the value of one die only. Soldiers, upon returning from the enemy's home row and having for the second time traversed the middle row, head back up into the enemy's home row again, never returning to their own home row. The king's movement. The king moves as described in the rules under the king's children. There are no indications that king's children were ever used in the racer variant. Capturing inactive pieces can be captured.